A little bit.
Thank you. All right, I had two comments to the board. One is to provide materials to the community members before the meeting so we could pre-read them and come prepared to ask substantive questions. And then the second thing is to have the comment period after the formal presentation so that we could actually address the things that were presented. Thank you.
Thanks. All right, we're going to move on to information items. This evening we have Rob Schwartz with RSP and Associates who's going to present our enrollment forecast.
All right, good evening. Pleasure to be here tonight. First, thank you for accommodating my schedule. I have 3 kids in college, so trying to get them this time of year is kind of fun, but also trying to get you the information that you guys need so you can make a good decision is what tonight is about. So as we begin this journey this evening, there's a lot of information to cover. And so let me talk a little bit about my team because we have a lot of people here who may be interested. What are the credentials of RSP? So I'm Rob Schwartz. I'm the owner of RSP. Founded the company a little over 20 years ago. My background is a planner, from being a school planner, being a planner for one of the fastest growing school districts in the state of Kansas. Again, for 20 years doing the planning. Prior to that, I was a city and county planner. Prior to that, a 98 Charlie military tech analyst with the United States Army. So a lot of my background is in intel, data analytics, trying to make sense of information. Think about it as intel. What we're talking about tonight is how can we make a good decision based on data. RSP is more than just Rob. There are other team members that have disciplines in the areas of planning, statistics, GIS, which is mapping, and then we also have former educators that assist us when we get into facilitation. That's key because the information that I'm presenting to you tonight is going to come at you in many different facets. Some of them will be visuals with bars, graphs, tables, but most assuredly some maps. What we're trying to demonstrate to you tonight is that we've tried to look at every possible data point to help you understand what's going to happen with our future growth of students as we see some changes that are happening with our demographics. The number of people and the type of students is very different in what we look at in the future. We're also going to try to help illustrate that there is development that's coming. It's in the pipeline and we have to plan for that. And how do we plan for that in a sustainable way that your community is paying the most efficient use of their tax dollars? I've listed off a lot of different projects. We do a lot of work up here in the west side of the Chicago-Burb area, and it'll range from enrollment analysis to capacity analysis to facility master plans and boundary areas. So tonight's meeting is a little bit different. It's just presenting to you information. The board, you asked for some data, some information to understand what's happening with enrollments, demographics, development, and then trying to understand capacity from a perspective that RSP calls functional capacity. So we're going to talk about a lot of things, and I know you may have many questions, and so we're going to try to allow for that to happen this evening. So that was a little bit about RSP. In this final report, there's lots of things that can be gleaned from individual pages. So we've tried to make this where it's somewhat understandable with some of the technical terms that we use as planners or analysts or geographers. But the point is that we want to leave you something that when you look at each of these pages, you understand what it could mean. So there are some helpful hints when you look through this presentation that our team feels may assist you in understanding some of the information when it gets time to understand what do we think about population or what do we think about the development and how does this transfer over into the decisions you as a board need to make to accommodate the student learning experiences. So the first thing is when you see a star on some of those pages, we think that is like a signature page that helps you understand a whole bunch of information. When you see a plus or a minus, it's going to indicate where it is something that we're indicating it's an increase or a decrease with something that's happening in your community. Trust me, there's not a lot of decrease elements that we have in here. Most of it's increasing. But again, this is some narration to help understand the report in general. There really are 5 parts to this. This is a typo on each of the parts, but they're broken down in these key categories. So if you want to find some information from this report, part 1 is the enrollment and demographics. Part 2 is going to get into the development and population. Part 3 is the capacity. Part 4 is the enrollment projections. And then part 5 is the next steps. So this gives you that synergy of how we build towards what potentially next steps are. I also want to state, when I talk about next steps, these are considerations, probably even more than just saying it's a recommendation. Things that we're gleaning as planning experts for the last 20 years. What have we seen other districts do when you're growing, and how do you think about those elements as you go through the understanding of this information? So let's talk a little bit about the enrollment and demographics. So I'd like to start out, page 6 is kind of the executive summary of what we're seeing in your report. So it's broken in 3 key areas. So when we look at your enrollments, you asked for a 10-year projection, and so as we're looking 10 years out, you'll see what that growth expectation is over the next 10 years. In this report, I'll get into the details of how do we build towards understanding some of those yield rates and existing units and the future units that are going to be built. But quite a bit of enrollment growth that's happening here. When we look at the middle portion, this is the capacity elements. And we look at functional capacity of your buildings. When we did that audit, how does that start to relate to where we're going to have pinch points, stresses in your buildings? This is from a number standpoint. What I have had conversations with your superintendent about is we didn't do a qualitative analysis of your buildings, meaning that I was not there when the students are passing and whatnot, but walking through this building or just being in this space, you can't fit everybody into this auditorium, right? And so there's some pinch points that are happening in your buildings that also need to be a part of your decisions of what you do with certain buildings, of how programs operate, the number of kids that can be in classrooms, all of those really cool things. I'll talk more about that when we get to the functional capacity, because that is an important nuance to this. The bottom part of this executive summary gets into the outlook with developments. We've had a great advantage of some of the conversations specifically with the city of Elgin on what's happening with growth in King County, some of the road projects, infrastructure projects. All of those have been melted into our analysis to understand a potential component of the timing of when some of these projects come online. Again, I'll talk more in detail about some of this development. This key page, more people, more capacity challenges, and development is happening in your community. So all potentially good or bad depending on your lens. So then as I move into some of the cool things in the report, there's visuals. So I'm a visual person. I imagine there's some people in the audience that are visual too. And this map makes absolutely no sense if you look at the purple line, right? The purple line is the district boundary. These were set back in the 1960s, and that's the geography that we have to work with the students that reside in your district. On this particular page, we're showing you the cities or villages that are potentially either in your boundary or just outside your boundary, so you get a sense of the geography of our purple line, and then how does that relate to these cities and villages. We then looked at your elementary attendance areas, and so you can see all of these different colors representing your current elementary attendance areas. Obviously, we have one middle school, one high school, 2 middle schools with different grade configurations, right? But one high school. We further break your district into some known geographies that I, as a planner, I'm interested in because I want to know some things specifically from the census. We just had the 2020 decennial census, and so there's some really cool data that we can break down into these census blocks. This map on page 9 shows you the yellow lines, which are census blocks. You'll see they don't coincide very well with your district boundaries. But what I also show you on this map is what we call planning areas. So we try to further break those census blocks into smaller known units that might be single-family units, mobile homes, apartments, duplexes, apartments, whatever that could be, to a level where we statistically can analyze what's happening. So certain number of units, certain number of kids. That's important because everything that we do for understanding your future enrollment is tied to statistics. So a sophisticated forecast model, it's statistics, it's regression. I've listed off a lot of the variables that go into each of the ways in which we look at what's happening to the planning areas. Generally speaking, with this formula, there's a formula that gets into where a subdivision is completely built out. What does that mean for a subdivision life cycle? So there's some times where there's been a lot of kids, then there's fewer kids, then there might be more kids. The bottom formula gets into a statistical analysis of areas that are emerging, so new areas, and how does this relate? So the big difference is a timing component of what we would call a building permit allocation model that's built into this. So if you think about any subdivision, there's a certain number of units that have been built, and so when we look at information that get into the economic cycle, that looks at who the builders are. Is it a D.R. Horton development versus something that's more of a local builder? How does that transition into a certain number of kids that would be elementary age, middle school, or high school? So that's kind of a little bit into the modeling. Page 11 really helps you understand if you say, I don't believe, or I think, or I was drinking coffee with my church friends and they said X, Y, Z was happening. Maybe some of those things will happen. We do pretty darn well with our projections, sort of COVID. We're typically 97 to 100% accurate in our 5-year projections. When we get 10 years out, there's a lot of things that get into variance. And so if you think about 10 years ago, nobody even knew about COVID. Nobody thought about some of these developments that we have out here on the west side of Elgin that have already been built, right? So lots of things have changed. What I want everyone to understand on page 11 is when you see our projections, we're giving you a likely projection. We don't give you a low, mid, high, we give you a likely projection. And to understand that if we under forecast your enrollment, what are some of the variables that might have influenced us to under forecast? So you can come here to page 11 and you look at the areas with the orange background. Those are some things that possibly happens. All of this is tied back to our modeling, and the beautiful thing about this, by us creating a modeling like this, let's say in 2 years or 3 years you want to do another study like this, we can come back and look at what were our assumptions for how each development would build and how did it actually build out, how did it generate a certain number of students. Another way to look at this information, think about mortgage interest rates. So if you remember, if you're like me, my interest rate on my house is 3%. Right now it's about 7%. That impacts what you can afford for a house. Every city, when you sit down and talk to the administrators or the people that serve on the boards, they're trying to find the ability to have low-income housing. That's a fight we're all trying to get at, right? So when the interest rates go up, what is affordable changes quite a bit on the amount of square footage, the size of lot, and whatnot. So we try to factor some of those things in as we look in this tenuous time of a election year. There's some unknowns, and that doesn't matter how crazy it might feel right now. It's this way every 4 years when we get to election years. We're looking at developments and what may happen. So one of our next landing points with understanding what's happening in your district is by bursts. And this has become really a critical part in our modeling, more than it has, let's say, 15 years ago when we were doing this. And the reason is we've started to pick up on a trend going back to 2018 across the Midwest, where we were starting to see fewer live bursts. So let's talk a little bit about this visual you see before you tonight. We're showing you the live burst based on the mother's address from 2009 through 2021. Ideally, we have 2022, 2023. That data is not, with the source that we have, been released, but we look at some other things with hospital information that's released, and we don't see something that's changing dramatically from what you see here. Let me explain this data. So we have the number of live births. If you go back in King County in 2009, we had over 7,700 live births. Come down to 2021, 5,600. So one of the things that has proven out is when we have a pandemic, we don't have children. They just don't happen, right? We're living in a district where there's a lot of building happening. So some of the stuff I'm sharing with you on live births is morphed by the development, and we'll talk about that in a moment. As you move across this table, what we start to understand is what's the market number of kindergartners that we potentially have 5 years later. So when I track across, in 2018, there was a little over 6,300 live births. Come across that row in 23-24, we had 309 kindergartners. Now, one of the things that is not so nice about this data is if babies were born in September, October, November, and December, the chance of them being kindergartners 5 years later, pretty low, right? The other thing that this doesn't fully account for is people that have moved into your community. Remember, I talked about development, so we had to bridge some things with what we see specifically to the planning areas and what's being built. What we then give you in those last 3 rows is what a potential range could be, just with this variable, of the number of kindergartners that we could see if our market share stayed similar to what it has been over the last 3 to 5 years. Here's the rub on this. With all of the new building, we should start to track, if the demographics come in, and we'll share some of this here in a moment, more towards the high side or potentially exceed the high side. This is just one variable. We start to tweak things out a little bit differently when we look at things down to that planning area. So as live births, just to kind of understand what's happening there, what's going on with the people in your community, number of kids that we potentially have 5 years later. We then started to analyze what's happening with your enrollment by grade. And so this goes back from the student data the district sent us from 2014-15 school year through 23-24. You see the number of students by grade, and then to the right you see what the total is for that pre-K-12 number, and then what that enrollment change has been year to year. One of the things that we talk about with a lot of districts is coming out of that pandemic year is what was COVID recovery of our enrollment, because we saw things where maybe it was stable or increasing and then it decreased, right? We saw about a 90 student decrease. We've fully come back from whatever that was, and probably differently than some of our neighboring districts that we work with here. So again, it's something that's unique to your district and has a whole bunch of different variables that probably are influencing why we see that. Some other things that we started to look at with your enrollment is to get a sense of what's happening as these students move through the system. So do they grow? Do they decline? Do they stay the same? So we started to look at that with that data on page 13 a little bit differently on page 14. So what is happening as those students cohort forward? The way our team looks at this is 2 ways. I look across the row to understand what's happened in any given school year, but then I look up the columns to understand, is there a trend that we're seeing where there's an enrollment increase or decrease that we can try to track back to some of the data as it relates to any of the planning areas throughout your district to know, hey, we're going to see either a bounce up, big bounce, maybe it's a small bounce. And so when we look from 8th to 9th grade, we see that we consistently have had increases, sometimes double digit, sometimes single digit. So again, you get a sense of what's happening with just your enrollment. The next stopping point generally with your enrollment was migration. And so when I talk about migration, this is with new students to the district or students that were receiving services, and then the next year that are not receiving services from the district. We're showing you here on page 15 the last 3 school years, and we show it by each of the grade bands of elementary, middle school, and high school. You're typically going to see some similar colors. If you're not color challenged, you'll see red is elementary, blue is middle school, green is high school. The green parts of the bars represent students that the previous school year were receiving services, and then in the following school year, they were not here receiving services. The orange part of the bar represents students the previous year they were not receiving services, but they are in the school year that we're analyzing. What we're trying to get a sense of with this migration is how quick is population changing for your students. And we have a lot of new kiddos in the district. The last 3 years have all been positive. The first two, for the 3 years back, 2 years back, a much bigger gain than what we've seen. Some of that's related to our exiting senior class. So I'll go back a couple slides and talk about another point here. When we look at generally your population, when I examine your senior class, I look at how does that compare to the incoming kindergarten class the following year. So if we go back to the 2022-23 school year, we had 335 seniors. We come to last year's kindergarten class, 309. So if that class is larger, graduating, than the incoming, we have to make up the potential for growth in other ways. That's explained by some of this migration. There's things happening as these students cohort into a new school year, year in and year out. So it was migration. We then looked at what was potentially occurring with your out-of-district population. And your out-of-district population, when we geocode your students, so match that address that's in your student database to a known address in the county and city files, there are students that would have an address that's not in your district. When we go back to 2019-20, here to 23-24, you see that's significantly declined. I think this is one important aspect to your district that may be different than some districts we work with out-of-district students. The out-of-district students aren't driving the challenges you have with capacity. What's driving your challenges is students that reside in your district boundary. Then the next landing point that we had was to understand what the movement was between your elementary buildings. And basically it's negligible from a statistical standpoint. Understanding this table, the left side represents the school that the student would actually reside in. And as you move across the columns, those would be the schools where the student actually was attending. Some of that might be from the parent choice. Some of that might be where programming is or is not. What I'm saying it's negligible is when we get to that far right column of net change, very minor. It's all single digits, right? All less than 5 student change. When I read down the column, that indicates where those were attending, where were they actually residing. So you get that in-out perspective on this particular table. So again, understanding some of the movement between the buildings. As we delve back into the planning areas, these next few pages provide a visual of what we're seeing as it relates to those planning areas. This particular map with the planning areas, we're trying to understand from 5 years ago, what has changed with our student population. Orange areas represent an increase, green areas represent a decrease. This changes year to year, and it's dependent on a lot of the things, like when the housing product was built, what the value of the housing product is. It gets into the transiency or what is the turnover rate of housing product in these areas. So just giving you a sense of where we're seeing change. Here on this map, we're illustrating with the student data, where are the students, right? So no surprise, they're on the east side of your district. So this is a density map showing all your pre-K-12 students. Red represents the greatest density of students, right? We know this, right? Where the housing is, that's where we're gonna see kids. So some of this I'm just preaching to the choir. You guys know what's happening in your district. So really the big thing that we saw as a summary of this section was related that there are a couple things that could lead towards a negative, meaning a decline. The first was diverse. The other was that if the senior classes continue to be similar or larger than the incoming kindergarten, you have to rely on some of that cohort change year to year to make up that difference. Some years it may be greater than others. For the increases, there's a lot of just typical cohort growth that's happening, and then with the migration, those two elements start to say, just from that enrollment standpoint, there's some growth that's going to continue happening in the district. That was enrollment. I want to stop there for the board. Do you have any questions about just enrollment portions? Or do you want to save your questions till we get to the end?
Do you want to wait till the end for questions? Or no?
Yeah.
All right, perfect. We'll wait till the end.
We're going to wait till the end.
All right, perfect. So then we transitioned in. So I did a tour of your district, driving around. I can't wait for the roundabout to go in on 20. It about wrecked my car. I'm sure that's not a first for anyone here. But so driving around your community, there's lots of infrastructure. There's lots of gaps in the infrastructure, right? And so being someone new to the area, that took me a while to get acclimated. I imagine your bus drivers have a lot of fun with the interconnections and different road construction projects, right? So one of our stopping points with trying to understand development is shown on this page. So I show 3 variables here, and I want you to see how they have some sort of impact or correlation with each other. So the green line represents census population as it relates to your district boundary. And we had a decennial census. There's always adjustments in almost every place that we work. It declines a little bit as far as what the growth potential is. But when you look at the last 2 years with that census population, it shows it's just going up a lot higher than what we've seen in previous years. That doesn't surprise me when we started to look at what's happening with the development. The blue line represents your certificate of occupancies. Now I want to tell you there's a difference between building permits and certificate of occupancies. We look at the building permits so we get a sense of what's in the queue. We're more focused on the certificate of occupants because that's when households actually move into that housing product. That's when we get kids. It's different with the type of building that's occurring here. There's some of your developments where it may take 7-8 months to build that house. Others where it might be closer to 4 months. So that's why it's important we look at the building permits, but we're really trying to focus on what that certificate of occupancy is. So you can see it's been pretty robust over the last few years of greater than 100 units, in some years almost 250 units. The red line represents our change in enrollment year to year. So the first thing we're trying to understand is, okay, what's happening with population? So we know it's increasing. We know there's building activity that's occurring in your community. But we know that doesn't always translate to the same number of students with either the population or the building trend. This gets into some of the nuances of who's having children, what's happening specifically with the millennials. I don't plan on having any more children. I already told you I have 3 in college. So if you think about the cycle of life, who's having the children? Gen Xers, we shouldn't be having children anymore. It's the millennials. What we know about the millennials, they're waiting longer and they're having fewer children. That means that as we look at our housing product, it's not going to be a linear thing that you can say we have 1,000 units and we're going to get this number of kids. We show you some of that in a linear perspective to understand what we're getting for yield rates, but it's definitely going to be a little bit different as we see some of the choices the millennials are making for how many and how long. The next few pages are some of that demographic data that you get from how we're extracting from the census, or specifically one of our business partners, Esri, which is the largest mapping company in the world. And so we use a lot of their data sets that correlate with census data. So you get a sense of where our population is, our income, our housing, our workforce, again, who's here. Some of this information that I'm talking about will be helpful in grants that you all write, because you'll be able to get some of this data a little bit easier at your disposal than trying to work through some of the ACS or census data sets. We give you a couple comparatives with the district, a neighboring district, and then what it relates with things with the city or the county, so you understand what it means with total population or some of the ethnicity components and who's here in our district. An infographic that starts to break down that population so you can again understand what is our ability to have students. And I want to give you a myriad of options that when you look at the data you can say with definitive understanding, yes, we have a population that's moving here that's going to have children, and we have to start providing whatever educational capacity that is needed at each of the different levels. We even give you some of the census employment outlook, so you get a sense of, based on the NAICS codes of who has jobs, what are those jobs that live here, and we show what their transportation to work is. Probably multiply that by 2 some days, right? But you get a sense of like what's happening in your community. Then I started to transition into yield rates, and what does that mean when we're thinking about different types of housing that's in your community. And I usually focus on elementary because this really sets the window of what we can expect in future years. I believe in the update that we have of this presentation in the appendix, we also include it where you can see the middle school and the high school. But as we focus on the elementary K-5, simply stated with this table, the bottom row is the district average of K-5 units. For residential units, how many students do we get for every 100 units? And in 2014-15, that was 27. You can see some years it went up to 29. Here in the last school year, it dropped back down to 27. But in this time period, we built almost 1,700 units. So even when it goes down 1 unit for every 100 units, we've built so many units, we just have a lot of kids. Other things that you see on this table, the green represents where it's 3 lower than what the district average is. The orange represents where it's more than 3 from that district average, so greater than. And to show you that there's differences between each of our elementary buildings. Average year built. So when we looked at the King County data sets with where product is with each of the parcels, the year that it was built, this gives us a sense of how old that housing product is. And the color ramp in the legend helps you know what specific time period that represents. So the older time period is going to be in the purplish, and then as you move to the blue, the green, the orange, and the red becomes newer housing product. We look at the median home values. Again, some of this looks really skewed when we look at our planning areas, and they're large, and so it looks like, hey, we have all this very expensive ag land, right? I know there's a lot of corn and soybeans out in areas that are red, but there's probably a housing product with the assessed value that jumped up that planning area to say, hey, look, it's really expensive. I know it's soybeans and corn, right? We all drive around, and when I was up here, I had to be behind several tractors. So that happens. Again, understanding what the age of the housing inventory and then what the cost is for the inventory impacts what we may see for the number of students in each of those planning areas. We then, with the year-built data, try to understand where the clustering of units have been built over the last 5 years. We're zoomed out so you can see a greater extent of this east side of the district, and also as an explanation, almost every map is going to have an inset off to the bottom left. We don't want anyone to think that out here where we are in Burlington that there's like nothing here. There's stuff here, but we're focusing on where do we see the development, where do we see the kids when we zoom into the east side of your district. Another way to look at all of this development here on page 31 is to understand what's been built decade after decade. So this visual, when I get to the 1940s and moving forward, the blue part of the bars represent the number of units that were available at the start of the decade. The orange represents the units that were built in that decade, except for the last column. We only have basically 3 years of data. And when you look at what's been built in 3 years of about 850 units with what's planned to be built, we're going to blow out of the water likely our fastest decade, which was the decade of 2000 to 2009. We're only 3 years into this. And there's a lot of stuff planned and some big players in this. So I mentioned that we've had conversations with the city village folks. We've tour the district, because I wanted to get a sense, like when we went out on 20 and we're looking at where that new roundabout is, and the city's like, hey, we've approved all this stuff, we're ready for things to go there, specifically on the southwest corner. I just see corn there right now, right? So what you're seeing on this map is the ability to understand that based on what we either saw or what the planners were indicating could be built, or where infrastructure was available, trying to give a timing component of when some of these developments can occur. They're all not going to be built, like for instance, we have green as current. They're all not going to be built in 1 year. It takes many years for a development to be built out. Yellow represents things where we could see activity within the next 5 years, and then as we transition to purple, where it could be closer to 10 years. This is dependent on several things. One, the great thing of being in the United States of America, if you own the lands and you have a desire to have it built, you can go into the city and you can work through their planning process to build your development. So some of this is dependent on who owns the lands, where infrastructure is, and of course, whatever's being built, is there a market for it? And so that's always kind of something that's ongoing that has to be monitored every year. That data on the map translates into this table here. And that's why I've been saying specifically, when I look at the number of units that potentially could be built, we're about 5,000 units between current 5-year and 10-year. We're not saying in 10 years all 5,000 of these units are being built. We're saying that in our model, we've tied in that in these areas we might see some of this activity. The closer we are to current, the more propensity, more strength we have in that actually is going to happen. As we move into the yellow, there's a little bit of uncertainty because there's some things that maybe are yet to be done before that development can happen. It might be extension of infrastructure. It might be going through the final plat process. So there's different things. And so one of our takes is you need to continue to monitor what's happening in the cities with some of these preliminary developments and final development plans. One of the things I mentioned, the roundabouts, and so when we get into this Pingree Creek South development, I just want you guys to get a sense that when we looked at this on a map and then I drove out here and you start to look at comparable subdivisions, and when this gets rolling, this is a lot of units and we have big players in this. So how soon will it happen? It's kind of a little bit of a wait and see. I think the city folks thought it would already be occurring because they've, I believe, feel like they've given enough of a green light that we should start seeing some dirt happening. So let's continue to watch for that. This is one of the big players in what we see for a future enrollment forecast. So again, all of the information that we put together starts to give you this synergy of our talking points. The majority of the things that could happen in your district are positive towards growth. I'm not saying positive, if you don't want growth out here, then it's all negative. I'm looking at it from the standpoint of units are going to be built. We have things that are occurring with the infrastructure and who owns the land and intent to build, that this should continue to happen. Some of our challenges is not unique to your district. It's supply chain. I think you guys are experiencing it here on your addition, waiting for parts for your AC, right? There's things that are happening in the building world still with maybe you have delays in windows or whatnot. So there's some things that are impacting how quickly we can build some of our housing product. And we still have to watch like interest rates. Is this new norm? Can we have sustainable purchasing of housing? I know my first loan that I had, I'm not going to date myself too much, but it was like about 12%. So again, it's all the lens you look from. 7% seems horrible, but it's been worse. And people still bought houses, but how fast? All right, so that was development. So as we took these pieces of enrollment and development and what's happening with things, we then transitioned into the next piece of what could be occurring with the use of your space. So I'm going to walk you through this information, and this is pretty cool. that your district had the initiative to start to look at how do we functionally look at our space. Not look at it from a space standpoint of what a building and code is or what the fire marshal says, but how are we using that space with the programs that are in those spaces. So let's just talk about why would we conduct this type of utilization. Well, generally speaking, when a district is growing, the first thing that will be asked and should be asked is, are you using your space efficiently? And there's always a misunderstanding of how space can be used in buildings. And I think it's similar if you think about your house. If you go into new houses now, typically there's a larger space in the foyer than what you may see in houses 10 years ago. Why is that? It's a trend. Why is it that there may be 2 offices being built in a house versus 1? Right? So if we apply this to schools and functional capacity, programs have changed over time. We used to have computer labs. We used to have different spaces with the programming model that was put in play with some of these buildings like 100 years old. It's different now. What technology can go in there? How do we use space? So we want to understand what that space is with the programs. We also want to understand that the way we use space today is going to be different in the future. And so how do we program our spaces to be functional, to be nimble in what those needs may be? So let's talk about some of the definitions that go into capacity. So there's a design capacity, and so think about this when the building was designed. Look at some of your newer buildings. The architect comes in, they work through a programming piece, and they say, hey, here's the number of kids that can be there. Well, over time, the building doesn't function that way, so the design capacity becomes outdated. Sometimes people will look at that square footage, and sometimes that's important when we look at the disparity between buildings. Is it a 700 square foot classroom versus, let's say, 1,000 square foot classroom? Program capacity, we're focusing on what's in the spaces. Is it special education? Is it an elective? Is it a core space? Is it a portable versus brick and mortar? We look at different class sizes, and we typically standardize that as a desired class size, usually a very low class size that you're maybe not able to meet. We have a standard class size. This is probably tied more to your teacher union contracts or goals that you, the board, have set out saying we're committed to what this size of number of kids in a classroom should be. We then have portable classrooms. I could just give a litmus of things about the challenges with portable classrooms. And when we are looking at our functional capacity, we pull that out. We don't think that's a desirable space for core programming, but it's a used space when you're growing and you need space and you maybe don't have the dollars to actually do the brick and mortar. Again, we can have a whole lecture on reasons behind why you try to minimize or eliminate some of that. And we'll talk about that in some aspect when we get to the functional numbers for each of your buildings. So that functional capacity tries to take all of those different things in each of your buildings and say, here's what that space should accommodate for the number of students with the programming that's taking place there now. This gives you some incredible opportunities. When you look at the programs and you think about the equity of what could be occurring in each of these buildings, from the age of the building, the square footage, things like, let's say, art. Do you have a equitable experience with art with, let's say, daylighting or size of the art classroom or storage for the materials? Do you have a kiln, right? All of those different elements go into making that a space where you say art should be its own classroom. We can't delineate that to say it's a core space. So you create an ed spec. So lots of different opportunities there. Some of the things to understand the functional capacity as we started to look at spaces. So we have core classrooms. Simply stated, at the elementary level, these would be your home rooms. When we move into the secondary buildings, it's our 4 content areas of ELA, math, science, and social studies. Elective non-core classrooms sounds just like the name. Those are things like art, music, broadcast, all of those things that, depending on the grade band, so elementary, middle school, high school, what are those potential electives those students have? Other program spaces, that gets into specifically things that we would classify as our special education, our gifted, our ELL, conference rooms, flex spaces, so things that are necessary. Elective spaces necessary, core spaces are necessary. The judgment of how space is being used is not that. It's to understand that for the programming the student needs, we need all three of these areas. And you'll see that as I start to show some of the visuals of capacity. All right, so we had some district class size standards. And honestly, this is probably a little bit higher than what I see in a lot of districts. When you guys ask me to be transparent on stuff that I see, and typically we see, particularly at the elementary level, we would want it to be lower. Well, why can't you make it lower here in your district? We don't have space, right? You would need, for instance, if we drove kindergarten down to 20, how many more classrooms would we need? We don't have them, right? So some of the things with your class size are related to what you have for space. So again, this is one of those nuggets that I'm giving you, that when you're talking about how do we plan for the future, if your goal is to have smaller class sizes, we have to plan for what does that mean, and what does that mean specifically, building by building, and can those buildings actually have additional classrooms? Some of the things that you have to consider are the width of the hallways. When do you start lunch? How long does lunch go? Do we have the right playground equipment for the age appropriateness of the students, of being primary versus upper elementary range, right? So there's a lot of things that you also still need to talk about when you're looking at what a final plan might look like for the solution of this district. These are your class sizes. There's some that are going to be smaller, right? If I have a special education class, I may only have one student in there, right? There may be some apparatuses they need or space that's required for that education of that student. So there's a lot of differences. These are just the generalities that I would say you apply to your core content areas. All right, let me talk a little bit about how you may have looked at space and how we're looking at space a little bit differently from this report. So the bottom is generally what we see with how capacity is calculated for a school. So you look at spaces and you say, hey, this is a size of classroom that is a size of classroom in that building. Count them up, and let's say you do a multiplier of whatever, 20, 25, 31, doesn't much matter. That's the number you get. The top one gets more at what we call that functional capacity. And you see there's different colors there, and it represents each of those three content areas, right? Core, elective, and other program space. These spaces are needed, and some of these spaces are somewhat mandated by government entities, whether it's the federal government or the state, of what you need to do for certain students, specifically when we talk about special education. So it's necessary. Another way to look at your spaces is the way this space is actually organized. So we put together a visual here on page 42 to kind of start with the classic, where it's just the rows and columns, teachers at the front, and you just teach them. We then see a hybrid where you start to group the desks together. But what we're seeing more often with new spaces, whether it's renovated or new, is this collaborative approach. And so when you look down there, you see some hard areas where there's chairs and a desk or table. You see some pull-out areas, and here we're just focusing on an elementary classroom. You can imagine you can do some different things when you get to the secondary. We have different spaces, and they're used differently, and typically this drives the number of students that you put in the classroom lower to be able to have a space that looks like this. Again, just giving you some information that, again, as you look at space, how are we going to look at this as we move forward? Is this the direction we need to go? All right, here on page 43, we kind of went through how our methodology works through the functional capacity. And so there's three major steps in this. So we have the data collection, we have the capacity calculation, and the product delivery. Should have said components because we have 10 steps. And this is how we work through trying to get you that functional capacity to understand how our buildings are currently being used and how we may have to do things a little bit differently. There may be some trade-offs on how we look at space. Here specifically was our process. Not as pretty as the previous slide, but basically we started out with trying to understand what the building administrators were saying the space was used by looking at the floor plans and having them complete what was being used in those spaces. We then validated that with the master schedules and the building floor plan and put that into how we calculate capacity to get a capacity for each of the buildings. Talk about that building by building here in a moment. That was the process. So as we started to look at some of the data that was provided by the district, we first started with the square footages. And we think this is a potential important piece as you plan out what is the next step. Where do we have the right square footage, and can some of this square footage be changed differently? And so this might be through a grade reconfiguration, a repurposing of a building to do something entirely different. Usually when we're tight as we are here, you don't have many options there until some additional capacity is brought online. And that has to be supported by your community. Page 46. So this page starts to help you understand how the core, elective, and other program space comes together. So the blue represents the core spaces at each of the grade bands. The orange is the elective spaces, and the purple is the special program spaces. Let me explain some of this. So this is the actual classrooms. When we get to the building floor plans, because of the designation that was made by the building administrator, what we saw in the master schedules, spaces that are not classrooms will also be coded in a color that represents this. And if they didn't fall in those three content areas, we classified it in gray, like admin area. We're not trying to say that it's just admin, but like for instance, we have custodian storage. We have general storage, we have conference rooms, we have different spaces that students may be using in some facet, well not the custodian closet, right, but they're using some different spaces, but differently than how they would fit in those three categories. And so nothing stood out here as far as having more than something else beyond with your portable structures. So we have 14 elementaries, and I think there's 2 high school portables. We put those in the other program space, and we specifically put them there. Yes, you're using them for core, but we're saying that ideally you wouldn't have any of those portable buildings. Again, trying to drive as you're looking at your future. If you're not going to have these portables, what would that look like? The repurposed functional capacity puts those spaces back in, so you see we're able to accommodate the way things have been and the way they are, and for a short time into the future with those portables. Without them, we would be in a very, very dire shape. So here by building, so here at the elementary level, you can see that breakdown of each of the spaces from core, elective, and then other program spaces. And we started to look at the functional capacity of the district. What you can see here to the left is the number of students that can be served with our current grade configuration by each of the grade bands. So 2,268 elementary, 1,460 middle school, again shared between the 2 buildings there, 4 elementaries. And then our high school is at 1314. As we move to the right, you see what that functional capacity percentage is as we look 10 years out. So you can see we run out of elementary capacity. Middle school is at about 92. High school is about 94. So one of the things that starts to create a storyline is our solution building an elementary building, and then we wait for what's needed at the middle school, and then again what's needed at the high school. That's one option, a bottom-up approach. We'll talk about some of the other options as we move through this. So we have some general guidelines when we look at space and how you try to identify, do we have the right space at each of these grade beams, and how do we look at maybe some different solutions. So typically at each of the buildings, whether it's elementary, middle school, or high school, we're saying you ideally want to be in that 85 to 95%. And typically in a growing district, we want to start planning for what this means building by building as these new developments come online, trying to minimize the disruption to students with boundary changes. And so once there's an understanding of where the growth is, the number of students, and a plans put in place for what capacity is going to be needed at each of these grade bands, you can plan for what those boundary changes look like. Parents are notified earlier. They know when the construction is going to begin. They know when you're going out for the dollars to be able to build those structures. They know it's built on the data points that we're sharing with you this evening. As we continue to move down through these bullet points, we talk about the portable classrooms and how we classified them in the other. We know they're being used for core, so that's how you're making it work. Potential solutions to balance utilization. I just listed some generalizations. So what we see in districts that are growing, what do they do to solve this? And it's the questions you ask. So let's say you're committed to, we want to have STEM labs in every building. You'd look at your buildings and say, well, what does it take for a STEM lab? Do we have the right space? Let's say we want robotics. What does that look like? So you start to get into, ask the question of what the students need, and do you have the right space for it? So some of the questions might be, we need to add physical space. There might be things, do you relocate some of the specialized programming? Well, my question to you is, where would you relocate it to? We're basically full, and we're telling you that, let's say at the elementary level, we're full. We're telling you that 85 to 95% is where you ideally want to be, but some of these buildings, based on the cafeteria size, the hallways, there may be limits that, yeah, you might be able to get, let's say, 1,300 kids, but what does that mean for how you serve lunch to those kids? And we may have too many kids. We may need to do something different, right? Sometimes there's a realignment of boundaries. Sometimes we talk about enrollment capping. And so enrollment capping would be, hey, we have a class size of, let's say, 26 in first grade. We're capping it. We can only have 3 sections. We move you someplace else, so you may have to go to a building further away. We've also seen alternative schedules with block schedules, or saying, teachers, you can't be in your classroom. You're going to have to go somewhere. Well, where is the somewhere, right? So if they can't be in their classroom, where is that somewhere? We also look at, are there places that when we did the functional capacity that you could repurpose as core classrooms? Well, again, there's a trade-off. If we have something in a core classroom right now, and let's say it's a special education, and let's say we found a smaller space. First, is it the ideal space for that kiddo? But then second, the trade-off is, what does that do for some of the other aspects that I've already mentioned? Lunch, playground, right? All those things. So really, as we look at some of these guidelines, you want to continue to monitor things with your enrollments, your demographics, your developments, and then how the programs are working or where they maybe need some help to be successful. So as we started to drill further into the conversation of enrollments with the projections, and how does this align with capacity? So the bar part of this represents the number of elementary students, and then we have 2 lines. We have the functional capacity, which is the solid line, and then the dotted line is the repurposed functional capacity. So simply stated, those portable structures are in that number. So you can see as we go out, with the functional capacity, we're over the capacity right around 26, 27, 27, 28. Which would mean we're utilizing it throughout the district. So it means it's really full in some buildings. And the conversation is, some of the buildings are going to be so full, we have to realign the boundaries. And then what are you going to do? You're moving from a full building to another building that's going to be full. So this starts to suggest we have some challenges, specifically at the elementary level. And we've been solving it here temporarily through portable structures. Also off to the right, I'm explaining some of the things you'll see on these pages. So we have the functional classroom inventory. So you see the number of classrooms and by the content of core, elective, and other. And then you see what that capacity is for the functional capacity. And then we show the utilization meter 3 different ways. The way it currently was in the 23-24 school year, and then what it would be in 28-29, and then 33-34, so 5 years and 10 years. Remember, what was the magic number? 85 to 95 across your district. We're above that, right? Even now. How does that look for each of the buildings? So one of the things that we've kind of pulled out here and focused just on reside, when you look at the projections, we show things reside, attend, and reside/attend. But here we're just showing the reside, so you get a sense of, with that elementary boundary, where are kids? And if they go to that building, what does this mean from the past perspective? And then as we move to the future. So we give you that functional capacity for each of the buildings. That's the second column. And then we move to the right, we're saying here's the reside enrollments. And then for the previous 5 years, actually 4 years, we show what the reside enrollment is. Then we show what that enrollment could be over the next 5 years for each of the buildings, and then the following years 6 through 10. And you can see the black bars representing those breaks between the 5-year and the 10-year. There's shading, and all this is orange, where we exceed what that functional capacity is. So it's pretty clear where we start to see some of our challenges in our buildings. If everybody that we're knowing is there now and that we're planning to be there with development that's being built and the natural changeover that's occurring in each of these already built subdivisions, here's what this starts to look like with enrollments and capacity. So Country Trails, Howard B. Thomas, and Prairie View all have issues through this time period. Then we show you building by building what the spaces started to look like as it ties back to that core, elective, and other program space. So nice pretty color to the spaces and how they're being used. This gets back where you hear me keep saying trade-off. We could change a elective space that's orange and make it blue, but what does that mean for the programming that the student gets? And if we do it in one building, are we going to do it in all buildings? So, for instance, are we going to make art on a cart? How do you do clay projects? How do you do some of the really cool things the students do? Very challenging. Other districts have done it. We could give example after example. When you're out of space, some of the things that happen. Art on a cart, music in the cafeteria, sometimes music in the hallways, right? Those lead to some challenges, right? So this gives you kind of that organization of not only the core classrooms, but some of the smaller spaces and how they're being used. And quite honestly, every district, your district's no different. We need more conference spaces. Think of our individual education plans, our IEPs. Where can we have those, and how can they be in a safe and a place maybe away from things that other people don't know what's going on? Those are things that when you're looking at the layout of your buildings and what spaces you have, how does that impact? So again, you see the meter for each of these buildings for the next 5 years, and really for all of the buildings, the repurpose is really the portable structures. And we didn't see any place where we could do something that we felt would not be an incredible negative trade-off to the way that the programming was told was happening in these buildings. You'll see this for each of the elementary buildings. That's why when you look at the portables, they're all in the color purple, and we know core areas out there. We've generally, from conversations, each district does things differently of how they use portables. We've seen districts do what you're doing, where it's core content, move them out. We've seen others where you move some of the other program space out there first. We've seen some say, hey, get the music out of there, then they're not impacting anyone in the core area of the building, right? So there's different ways to look at it, and each has advantages, each has disadvantages. Here's Lily Lake. So 285, 335 building. We get to Prairie View, 656 or 756. Then as we got to the middle school building, so 2 buildings with 6, 7, and 8, how does this start to look? And so just using the buildings right now, it would appear we're within that range, right? I said 85 to 95. Most of that is at Central, not at Prairie Knolls, right? So we have some issues at Prairie Knolls. So what do you do with some of those challenges? I'll talk about that here in a moment. So again, we're in this conversation that we're seeing some of these larger grades move from elementary to middle school and high school. They're going to have this cascading effect of what capacity means at each of those levels. So as we looked at this, 85 core classrooms in the spaces. You can see what that current functional is. Currently, 28, 29, 33, 34. I'm going to talk about a way to look at this from the top down after I talk about the high school. So again, here as we look at the buildings, we have space at Central Middle. But when we look at Prairie Knolls, we run out of space, right? As early as 27, 28, we're definitely in that above 85% capacity through the bulk of this time period. And so what do we do with space? There is some impacts on the programming that's occurring in that building. And you'll see that visual for Prairie Knolls. The 851, 967. And then with Central Middle School being 609 and then 638. All right, so when we look at your capacity, so not quite yet, I don't think you guys have gotten your occupancy for the 20 classrooms, but we're showing that sometime this school year with those 20 classrooms, we go from 1314 to 1914. Clearly, when we look at what your capacity was being 1314, and you exceeded that even in, 21, 22. So we already were beyond what that capacity is. Someone will have to show me out of here with the maze here, right? Like this happens in buildings when we do addition, right? Some of the connectivity of the building kind of loses a sense of how you have the structure in a building. Some things I want to talk about when we were looking at functional capacity. We didn't walk the building for the qualitative approach, but one of the things that we asked when we were looking at the spaces is, do we have appropriate space for, let's say, labs? And that's something that we're deficient here. We need more labs for what that educational experience could be. With the 20-room classroom addition, we have more capacity, but is it the right quality of capacity is a question you have to ask yourself. And that's something with the educators, what's going on there. So when we started to look at this, we're seeing what's happening with your enrollment. We're giving you some ideas of what you might do with things that are like from enrollment capping, realigning of boundaries. I've talked about the bottom up with where elementary has some issues. Some other districts start to look at it from the top down, where they're saying, hey, if we're going to need space throughout our system, we know we're going to grow into being beyond what the capacity is at the secondary. Is there an idea of adding the capacity at the top, and then you start to shuffle some things down? Or is it a hybrid approach? Is there some things at the top, and is there some things at the bottom? And the top might be, is there a way to put the appropriate space in the high school that you would see in other sized high schools similar to yours, which is about 1,900. Can you accomplish that? Talk more about that in a moment. But you can see some things that as we look at the building, we don't have space. We have those 20 classrooms. We now have the space for the core content areas. And then as we move over in time, tracking towards 1,800 kids, we're going to start running out of capacity at the high school level in this 10-year time period. Again, the visual of what that space looks like. And and then the projections. So this is going to get into the whole kit caboodle of things that we've kind of sprinkled a little bit in the capacity, but we'll talk about this in a general role. So red is going to represent the elementary, blue is the middle school, and green is the high school. There's two bars, black bars, that separate the past enrollment to what's projected in the next 5 years and then the following 5 years. There's a purple line that's on the top of each of those bars that represents the number of students aggregates pre-K-12. So right now we're at about 2,300 elementary students. I'm growing towards 2,600 students as we get out to 33, 34. Right now we're at about 1,200 middle school students. I'm growing to a little over 1,300 students in 33, 34. At the high school we're at about 1,500 and growing to over 1,800 by 33, 34. This information here I'll talk about on the next page. So 68 is a descriptor for what we see with the information here. So with each of the buildings, we're showing it similarly to what we did in the capacity, where you can see what our functional capacity is and what the enrollment was in the past, what it will be in the next 5 years, and then the following 5 years. Again, trying to help you understand in two places in this report, whether you go to the capacity section or you come to the projections, where are we seeing enrollment growth or enrollment change, and how do we start to plan for what that solution might be. Same thing with the secondary buildings. Again, our goal is to be at 85 to 95%. There are some buildings that in certain years were under 70%, and that's where we have challenges with how we program. Could be class sizes, could be what we do for counselors, PE teachers, music teachers, right? So there could be some challenges with central. So again, most of our observations for your projections, it's going to grow. What I want you to think about is, if we just built no more units, if you go back to like pages 8 and 9, wherever the enrollment is by grade, we say we're not building anything more. Let's say you can do your magic wand and we're not building anything more. Just naturally what's happening in this district, we're having more students. So when you add in the growth factor, how much growth, how quickly that happens, let's say we're under forecasting what amount of growth there is, we're going to grow more than what we're forecasting, which is why I say go back to page 9 where we illustrated if some of these things start to happen differently than what we've indicated would happen, it's going to be different. And so that's why you want to monitor this year to year. All right, my last part, next steps. All right, we said enrollment's going to increase, and we talked about some of our realities of capacity. We're going to have challenges with capacity. We're going to need to continue to monitor things with diverse, the graduating class versus the incoming kindergarten class. What's happening with our migration? It's slow, right? We showed you where it was almost 300 and now it's under 100 in this most recent year. Development trends, what's happening with building? I mean, just today, just driving around, it's happening, right? A lot of people thought it would significantly slow as interest rates went up. I mean, it's slow, but we're still seeing a lot of activity in spite of that. This is a page where I'll spend a little bit. This is my last page, and then we have questions. So I tried to give you some things that would be like factual findings that you see as nuggets throughout this presentation, this report. And then I've also tried to give you some ideas to consider for solutions, because sometimes the bottom up may be the right solution, sometimes the top down, or it might be some sort of hybrid. My goal here was not to say, hey, something that you've done in the past is the right way, or something that people in the community might say that might be different is the right way. It's more to give you the data points, and with this conversation that we'll have in your questions, maybe some of the expertise of what we've seen in other districts, for you to consider and determine what is the best thing to do for the district. I don't get to vote on these things. You all get that pleasure, right? And sometimes it's hard. particularly when we have to do things that maybe are different than what people maybe want to see done. So let's talk a little bit about these challenges that are occurring. So there's an imbalance of students and where facilities are. That's not anything new, right? We're in the central part of the district right here for the high school, right? And most of the growth's on the east side, and they're coming this way for some middle school grade and high school, right? So we know there's this imbalance, and there's going to be continued transportation challenges because of where our buildings are located and where we can't get buildings, right? If we could get a building closer to the east, then it makes a lot of sense, right? So we have limitations on land acquisition and what the cost might be to get that land. So maybe this is a ploy out to the developers, hey, we need some land, right? Give us some land, free land, right? We also know that there's likely some limitations in your programming in your buildings to be able to have the robust offering that provides that quality space. And so I've listed a few things here with science labs, CTE spaces. Those are always changing, and they need some different things that you maybe can't get in a standard classroom. We're also talking about how your facility planning with where the growth is and where the kids are. How do we accommodate those kids that are really here on this northeast side of the district? And so we've given you kind of some comparisons of like Highland Woods and then this new subdivision that's supposed to go online with Pingree Creek to say, wow, that's a lot. That's a very significant development that's going to generate kids. So those are challenges that when they happen, we need to be thinking about. And so the solution is more than just space, it's other things. Some of the solutions, and this is, we could have maybe created a whole nother page with just possible solutions, but these were just some general things that we started to understand. So we've done a lot of work with changing some of the impact fees, specifically in the Naperville area, that would help accommodate the advantage the school district needs for facilities. But as we got to looking at what you have, there's options, whereas these developments come online, that you could get land in lieu of dollars. And so that may be something that some other districts we work with south of here, they need the money, they don't need the land. And so this may be something that is a conversation if getting the land in the right place is a challenge. We also believe that a facility master plan or a future facility plan focusing on some of these items so that you can map out and the community knows specifically how this ties back to your strategic plan and what you're trying to do for the evolving educational needs or spaces for students over the next 10 years. And then I mentioned this top-down or bottom-up approach, and it may be both. It may be the bottom-up or maybe the top-down. And so just trying to think about how our spaces are today. You may say our existing high school, because it doesn't have X, Y, and Z, may be a more appropriate middle school facility for what the spaces would be. It'd be a really like killer middle school space, but it may be deficient as a high school for some of these other spaces. You may say that if we do it in addition, which may be limited with an addition out here with different things, whether it's the infrastructure with sewer, electrical, parking, all of these different things, you may need to get more land. You may need to do some things, again, provide a renovation or a new space that would have some of these labs and whatnot. We also could talk about how do you do a reorganization of your district. And so conversation about is Prairie Knolls best served as a middle school? Would it help with your elementary and you start to look at something that would be different for the middle school? Some other things that we've seen happen in districts, and one's down, if you're familiar in the Kansas City area with the Legends area, with the racetrack, school district there, Piper School District, they needed a new high school, but they didn't have the dollars to build the new high school. So when they built their new elementary, it was designed with the front office to be a high school. Here, I think this weekend, from going to the open house of that elementary building is now a high school. So again, they had this idea that we need space at the elementary, but ultimately we need to have the quality spaces that would be at the high school. So the building was designed from the onset. We're serving the elementary, but then it's going to become a secondary building, a high school. So again, different solutions. Those are things that you guys have to kick around. I wanted to at least kind of give some of those elements for you to think about. I'm going to open up questions, comments. If I can answer them with my knowledge base here, and I can answer it with 100% certainty, I'll give it to you. If I don't, I'll get back to the superintendent and give you that answer at a later date.
I had a question regarding your numbers for the full utilization of each school. Is it maxed out per class size? I mean, our class size is like high school is 30, so just an easy figure for high school is with the 20 classroom addition times 30 kids in each classroom, that's an additional 600 kids. But you're not taking, like, it just doesn't seem like it's playing in the cafeteria space, gym space, all those other electives and other classes. And what if one of those high school classrooms only has 18, because we need 18 kids to run a class. So what if 10 of those classrooms only have 18 kids? Now that lowers our capacity by 120 kids. You know what I mean?
Correct. So when you go from that 13-14 to 19-14, it's simply that mathematical equation. And so capacity is kind of one of these nebulous numbers that as you change what the programming is, or sometimes even in the elective space, students vote with their feet, right? So if there's a program they want, there may be closer to the maximum of that capacity, but then there may be other programs where it's a much lower number. So this is saying if you efficiently utilize those spaces as designed, whether it's core, elective, or other, this is where you're at. But which is why we go back also to say that 85 to 95%, that gives you that comfort level of how a space is programmed. But what it doesn't do is, what does it mean for passing periods? What does it mean for, you mentioned lunch. It's not easy to do open lunch here. You don't got a McDonald's around the corner, right? So they got to be here. So all of those things have to be taken into consideration, that as you increase the number of core classrooms, it has other impacts on how other spaces need to be used. Excellent question.
Can you explain the functional capacity? Can you go over that a little bit more and explain to me what that means? I know in the report I talked about PK through 5 is at 112%, 6 through 8 is at 91%, high school is at 94.3%. So it looks like the PK through 5 is way over the recommended 95%, and the others are just bumping up at the upper edge of functional capacity. So what does that mean? And when you go over functional capacity, what, if any, negative impact does that have in teaching?
Excellent question. So let's kind of try to dissect that in a couple of different ways. So first with that functional capacity, and right now we're saying that functional capacity is not using the portable. So you already innately recognized that you were having issues in these buildings where we have between 2 and 4 additional classrooms at the elementary level. So you brought them out. You couldn't house all those kids physically in that building. So you already made a change. So when we look at that difference between the functional and the repurposed capacity, those give us 2 different realities. So if we dissect into what does this mean for students, while we've given this guideline of that 85 to 95% is where you want to be, because it gives some flexibility of how you can use the space. And let me give you a specific example. So if we have 26 students in a kindergarten class. I think that was your guideline. And we now have a 27th. We need a second space technically, right? Well, there's a little fudge room there as far as how you can use paras, teacher aides, and whatnot. But when you look at that functional capacity, we reach a point of no return where the physical constraints of the infrastructure just really can't handle what we're having occur in that building. And I'll give you some other examples to that. Pick up and drop off. So our ingress, egress out of these sites may start to spill off the sites and onto the streets. We may have intermixing on the sites of things that naturally happen between walkers, pickups, and buses. And I think you guys have minimized that as best as you can on some of the newest facilities. That's why we ultimately are trying to hit that 85 to 95%. So if you do have a class that pops, back to my 26 to 27, we have that classroom there. So think of it as like bubble classrooms. And so some of the inefficiency allows for you to adapt for the different growth that would be associated to your attendance boundaries. Let's dive a little bit deeper into this. Some of the challenges could be your attendance boundaries. And so that's why I gave an example of enrollment capping. So some districts are like, hey, we know we don't have any space. We've already put the portables out here. Our physical brick and mortar space is full. That 27th student comes, they have to go to another building. This is why when you come into this meter and when we get out 10 years and we're at 112%, we're already way beyond what the space could be. So we've already maximized everything you possibly can, short of adding more portables. I think that answers all the things you had.
Thank you. I do have one follow-up. The recommended ranges for functional capacity, where do you derive that from? Is that like a best practice in public education? Is that an RSP recommendation?
I wish I could take the 100% credit, but it's actually a best practice, and there's organizations that we're affiliated with, one which is A4LE. There's different things that get into like site sizes, and those have some nuances because do you build 2-story or 3-story buildings, right? But typically you want to be in that 85 to 95% range. And you'll even see that from the architects when they're designing their buildings, they ratchet it down because they know the spaces are going to be used differently once it's opened up and the kids are utilizing what that space potential could be.
Thank you very much.
Robin, kind of just jumping off this question. So if you have buildings like we do that are growing in enrollment consistently, we're looking at 23 for, we already know for 24, 25 we're off, right, in enrollment. We're breaking sections everywhere across our district. And we have something that's close to, say, that 90%. Is there a range administratively that we should look at to say, we know we're a growing district, we know that we're sitting in this capacity range, but if we keep popping sections, obviously we're in some tough spaces in some of our buildings. Is there a range we should be looking at, saying, okay, we need to get more mobiles so that we're ready for this? Because we know at the elementary we're there, but we're going to be close to the Prairie Hills Middle School. Obviously, high school 20 classrooms takes care of the classroom setting, but it doesn't take care of some of the other things. But I'm just curious, that 85 to 90 is a pretty big range, especially in a growing district. So how do you capitalize on those percents to help you kind of project? We need to have 3 more mobile units for next year, or 6 more mobile units, or whatever we're going to need to be able to get through for the growth.
Great question. So here's a couple of things that I'm assured that you're probably already doing. So in the spring with your registration, you get a sense of what is going to be happening. So let's make this a May of year. You see what that number is. You then lay that over what the RSP projection is for the next year. And we've given it to you by building. It's not by grade, but it's by building. And then as you start to see building by building, let me pull up my visual here. when we go to the core classrooms that are available, building by building, you're going to know with your class size that you have as your probably negotiated contract with the teacher union. You know what that size and you know the number of classrooms you have. The first thing that administration has been doing is, okay, so let's say when we're looking at Country Trails, we have 27 core classrooms. We have 6 other programs, so those are the portables. And then we have this, and it's some special education, I think there's 2 special in there. And then we have 4 elective. Can I change that 4 electives to something else? Well, no. When you go to the breakdown of what those are, well, then that would mean you have to move art on a cart, music, right? So I think it starts in the spring when you're like, wow, we already have 27 classrooms. And when you're looking at that class size, are we, let's say, +1, +2 from where we make that break? And then that's decision that comes, okay, do we have the space for portables? Do we have the infrastructure for portables? Because some districts, and I can't remember, I think all of yours have restrooms out in them. Do you have restrooms out in them, right? That's additional cost for infrastructure. So you start to look at it in May, and then as you go through the enrollment over the summer, here we are in August, not very easy to get portables in here, so you have to make those decisions back in May. And so how certain are you of the development activity? So you start looking back, how many homes are being built? And so look at the information here. And so I think we've been averaging, 150 to 220 in some years. Well, I think it's ramping up with some of these developments. And we're going to see a lot of units. So are we building those number of units? What's your comfort level of saying, let's get another portable, or let's do enrollment capping, or let's do a boundary change? If you're going to do a boundary change, you want to do it well before the school year over, right? So if we're seeing some issues already this year and going into next year, and a boundary change might be a solution, you want to get that out to the parents sooner than later. I'm doing that in August. We'll get a packed house in here, right? Well, a packed house anyway with it changing, but at least people will understand why you're doing it. Because I think it's going to tie back to the data, right? What's the enrollment? What are we actually seeing? What is the capacity of our buildings? What are we doing here? And again, you're efficiently using your spaces as best as you can. We didn't see any place that we could say, hey, move this out, because sometimes there's space that's using an actual classroom. Where else in the building would you put it? So then as you start to look in those smaller spaces, well, would that actually work? Probably not. I don't know if that really answers your question. It always kind of gives kind of pulls a little bit of the veil of like the things that I know all administrations are working with. Like how do we effectively manage the space and provide what's right for kids? And that's kind of a hard balancing act.
One of your solutions and considerations are the top-down. Well, one of them is, I don't know if this is top-down or bottom-up, but build the new high school and then use the existing high school to become the middle school, right? That's one of the solutions. And in the projected 5-year growth, the middle school will be at about 1260. So how does that look for the high school then for that many students? Is that, where does that fall in the functional capacity? And is that a positive? Is it a negative? Is there too much cushion there?
All right, so there's several questions there. So first is if the high school becomes a middle school and you have a 1900 high school capacity, what potentially might that capacity be for middle school? It's kind of, there's 2 parts to that, and maybe even others. The first part is, how are you educating those middle school students? and are they effectively, let's say, in a middle school team? So the way we may look at the capacity at the high school, where it's 1,900, it may be a little bit less than that for the inefficiency that happens with teams, but what you get with the educational programming is a little bit different. How we use elective spaces also is different. And so when you go from a use of a building, whether it's a high school to a middle school or a middle school to an elementary, you give that lower grade level band really an infusion of like possibilities of spaces, right? And you really see it significantly from a high school to a middle school because of some of the spaces like an auditorium, or there might be amenities that are, let's say, the track or a football field or something. So what does that mean when we look at this with the middle school? We have to re-examine some of those spaces to say, would it be 1,900 or would it be something different? Usually it would be something less because of the way programming is at the middle school level. It's a little bit different than the high school. So the efficiency, when you look at the number of students, you're still going to have some space, but what you can do with the space may be different. Let's say you provide more conference rooms. Let's say there's more social mental well-being type spaces. Those are things that are becoming more discussed the farther we get from COVID. It was talked about a lot before COVID, now it's talked about a little bit differently. So that was the first facet of like, what does it mean for the efficiency? The second piece is, how many kids do you really want in a middle school building, right? There's things you can do with the building, particularly if it's a new building, that you can do a school within a school, where you can have different grades in the building and they don't really cross mingle. So you have to look at the spaces here, and could you do something like that where the number of students could be greater than maybe what you would have a comfort level for the middle school population. I think that generally hits
Thank you.
big things there.
So my takeaway is that you're not really making recommendations because you're a data guy. So you're giving us the data for us to decide what we kind of want to do, what avenue we want to go down. You're giving us possible solutions, possible, not even recommendations, but just possible solutions that could work for our district as you see it.
And opportunities, and there's like some trade-offs. Everyone always, when I come to meetings like this, they want me to say, here's the riding in on the horse and here's the solution. I think it always comes back to, what are the voters going to support? And most of that is, do they believe what's happening in the district actually is happening? And so this is really the kudos to you as a board and administration to have a third party like RSP to come in. We didn't come in to support anything that you guys have done in the past. We've looked at the data. Our reputation is look at the data and let the data guide what the possibilities are for the solutions. So we feel pretty positive, statistically positive, that you're growing and you will grow, and there's going to be some capacity needs, and I think there's still some questions on the capacity that you have to come to an understanding of, and I think it's that qualitative. Do the students in high school, are they getting what they need? And some of it's more than what the ACT scores are, or where these kids are going off to, whether it's a trade school or a university or some certification. Are they, when they go to the places where their next step is, are they prepared for that? Did you have the right experiences here? If you start answering those questions and there's more like, gosh, we're challenged, we're making it happen. Because I will tell you this, no matter what the space is, if we have educators, they were coming up here to this microphone, they would be making some really incredible things in spite of space or in spite of having some of the technology things. And that's a credit to them and your system. But you're trying to remove barriers, right? That's something I always try to tell boards. You're trying to remove barriers, you're trying to provide opportunities for these kids. And if you're not hitting those, then it starts to lead you in a direction that may be similar to what you've talked about. It may be something different. And I think the next step, you need capacity, and how you solve it, you could do from the bottom up, or you could start to look at the inefficiencies in some of your high school spaces here, and how does having a new high school or a significant remodel, how does that change that? But there are some things you can't get away from, and it's where the kids are and where your buildings really are not, right? So there's always going to be this transportation challenge. And where do you want that transportation challenge to be at? Is it better with students on a bus, or is it better where it's students in the car and it's teenagers driving, right? Those are questions your community gets to provide you an answer to.
Yeah, most of us love to drive, that's why we moved out here, so. Anyone else for Rob?
I'm good now.
There's just one other point that I wanted to ask is, in your data research,
Quiet.
I'm too
I'm
quiet.
telling you, be quiet.
Wow, all right. In the data that you uncovered, in the certain areas that you looked at, obviously there's some aged folks that are moving out and families moving in. Is that baked into the groups in planning and the data development that you put forth in, take for instance, page 9, there's a lot of density in some of these areas, but there's also some neighborhoods that are turning over, and the folks that have enjoyed the district or other districts are moving out and newer folks are moving in. Is that part of this?
Yes,
Uncovering?
absolutely. So page 10 is the great illustration there of what everything you were just talking about is a subdivision life cycle. And so in this statistical modeling, we've built in that there's developments where the kiddos were here when it was built, it's all shiny and new, and now those people went through the system. And then as they age out, some of the things that we try to look at is, are those developments, are they single story, are they bi-levels, are they 2 stories? That starts to have an impact of how soon they may move out. But other things like what's happening economically with like jobs, which is why we get into like some of the things that are regionally happening here that are influencing people to keep moving a little bit farther out. All the corn is going away in some places, or soybeans, right? I was telling my wife, she's like, it just seems like everything's soybeans and cornfields. But we factor that in. Like there's a natural cycle that's happening in developments, and the age of the inventory, the value of the inventory really play into how quickly we see some of that regreening or grading of each of those areas.
Thank you.
All right, I think you wrapped up our questions for you.
All right, I'll appreciate the time you guys gave me tonight to explain this, and we're available for questions through the superintendent as you move through this process.
Yeah, it's a lot of data to consume, so if you have questions. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so I wanted to discuss with everyone, we have, if we want to do a referendum again this fall, we have to have referendum language decided on by August 19th. Our board meeting is Monday. So I wanted to get a sense from everybody where we're at regarding that, remembering that this is a presidential election. We don't know what's going to be on the spring ballot. And if we want to get the majority of our community members out there to vote, I think the fall election is a must. So if we're in agreement on that, I'll let you guys talk too, but we have to decide what language we want to do. We can obviously keep the high school 195 language. We can go in elementary, we can go in middle school. It's up to us. We don't have to decide the language tonight, but we should decide which way we want to go. So we can decide on Monday the exact language, because we'll have to get PMA involved with this. So any feedback?
Yeah, Jeff, my feedback is that we should have referendum language in, on the ballot. And the reason is we took the time to get this expert to evaluate the data. And what's clear is that something needs to be done about the capacity issues. And so we've done that due diligence with the input and the request of the community, and now we should use that information that we received by virtue of this report and this presentation to move forward.
I'm in favor.
So as much as I feel like it's quickly approaching upon us, I don't feel it's fair to our students to put it out further, and that it is probably best for our district to get it on the ballot in the fall.
Mark?
Yes, I'm turning it on. If I can see it, good Lord.
I want to play devil's advocate for a second.
Go ahead.
In the community, I know some members may feel that we should look a little closer at mobiles. What is your stance on that, especially given what he was saying with the functional capacity and possibly just increasing the number of mobiles, basically, is kind of how I read it, to kind of band-aid us through, to, I guess, think it through a little bit more. What's the board's stance on that? Just kind of kicking the can, in other words, and then just getting more mobiles at some of our elementary schools to help with some of that capacity issue that we're already experiencing.
Personally, I don't like mobiles. I don't think they're a great learning experience for kids. We had a lot of weather issues. Some of them froze, the sewage lines in them, so they were, kids had to walk into the actual building to use the restroom. Which kind of they're fifth graders, but who knows if we would always put fifth graders in mobiles in the elementary school. As Rob said, it's just not a conducive learning environment. So I think looking at more of those, unless they're out of necessity, which maybe they will be, I think is not a good way to look at things to, move us in a positive direction as a school district.
Jennifer, what's your stance on it from a special education stance?
Like, I don't have a microphone.
Sorry.
I mean, I can talk really loud. I have been in education for a long time. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry, probably too loudly. Mobiles are awful, having been in them in an education standpoint. Also, my question is, financially, what's the cost to not only purchase more, but maintain and then repair what we keep having to fix? Mold's an issue, the freezing, the plumbing. Do we want to continue to flush money down, figuratively, that drain with having to keep going that direction without fixing the problem?
Esther, what's the cost? I know you know it.
Well, I don't
Can we even get them?
I don't know the cost exactly.
Quick, Mary. Yes, it's on.
Thank you. I don't know the cost. It's roughly about $1 million to get additional mobile units that we currently have. Additionally, we put a lot of money into just sewage drops. Whether we want to talk about, if that's what we would do, my recommendation would be to consider actually putting a sewage system in that we could drop it into the ground versus having pump stations out. It's an added cost that comes out. It's definitely not a long-term solution. For our staff, I will tell you, our staff definitely do not like teaching from mobile units. The quality of mobile units are not high. We had to put new flooring in after 1 year. We definitely have leaks that happen inside the classrooms all the time. Ceilings are being consistently, fixed, even though they're not that old. Also, the location, it would take up parking spaces at Prairie View and at Howard B. Thomas. We'd have to locate them on the parking lot. There would be an added cost to Country Trails to actually do earthwork. Currently, where Country Trails mobile units are located, they're located close to the park or to the playground. If you've been over to Country Trails, you know that there are houses directly adjacent to the property at this point in time. We put a fence up to try to limit walls going into people's yards this summer. In addition to that, we now have to figure out how we even put some kind of pad out there, which would require some additional earthwork. So the dollars that would be associated with placing mobile units on the school, and we may still have to do that. Like if the referendum doesn't pass in November, we are in dire straits. So mobile units may be a necessity anyway for the short run.
Well, I think we're in a people business, and I think we owe it to the kids and the teachers to make sure that we do this right. I'm in favor of doing the referendum again. I think it's important based on the numbers that are increasing. I'm not sure that they captured everything, but the reason why we all came out this way was to get good education. And I'm not in favor of piecemealing a district together. I'd rather do it all at once and do it right and then move forward. So that's just my personal stance. That's where I'm coming from. So I agree with you, Jay. I think we need to do something this November.
So I guess those of you who said you're in favor of a referendum this fall, as am I, same high school still? I mean, are we still gonna shoot for that? Or seeing that he's, elementary, the report came back saying we're gonna be overutilization on that. Is it worth it to do an elementary school, knowing that our high school is gonna be up and middle school? I mean, is that a Band-Aid or is that a legitimate, viable option?
Well, first, I think it's important that the board understands that an elementary school will fix the problem today. As you watch the report, you see growth happening in middle school and high school. You're looking at 2033, that's 9 years away. That is tomorrow. As much as we don't want to think about that, that's tomorrow. So I think you have to consider, do you want to keep going back to the well to the community members? Because that is what will happen. You go to the well for elementary school, we will turn around, the well for the middle school, and then the well for something else. So that's an addition to construction, where you're going to put it on here. The challenge of this property, and talking to our architect, talking to the civil engineers, is we have to plan for what they call the 100-year flood, right? And so there is a lot of retention, detention that we have to take. Could we restructure Central Middle School to be into a high school campus? Yes. If that is the will of what we want to do, it's a matter of how do you restructure it, how do you get kids from Central Middle School back to the high school. It's a long distance for kids to walk. You could make a 9th grade center, a 10-12 center. That's definitely an option that if you had a middle school you built a new middle school, still use Prairie Knolls as an elementary, could be an option. Remembering that the heat map shows that all of our elementary kids, or most of our property, is on the eastern corridor. So having another elementary on the east side, on that northeast side over by Elgin corridor, makes more sense. We don't have, the property here is going to bus all those kids back here. They're going to drive past their schools that they should be attending to get to where they need to go. Currently, if you look at our boundaries, the interesting thing about our boundaries right now, if you actually lived in Howard B. Thomas, if your house was at Howard B. Thomas, you would not go to Howard B. Thomas, you'd go to Lily Lake. If you actually live by Prairie View, you actually would not go to Prairie View, you'd go to Howard B. Thomas. Because of the way our density works, all of our population has to go westward to get our kids, and the current boundaries. The boundary maps, when you look at our population, the boundary shift is going to force us to bring some people back to the east, but there's nowhere to go. Howard B. Thomas is the one that we moved boundaries last time, and they're going to be the one that's going to be the fullest, if you look at the report, and the most challenging for us. And we really, those kids are coming from over by the Elgin corridor. So the question becomes, do you want to bus kids all the way over, or do you want to have an elementary school that's more of a neighborhood school, similar to Country Trails, Prairie View, and where Prairie Knolls is seated? Those are things I think the board has to consider when they're looking at the decisions for the long run for the district. This is a long-term fix. If we're going to go ask for dollars for community members, so we don't keep going back to the well, I think you want a long-term fix, not something that's going to get you out 10 years.
And you don't want to step over dollars to pick up pennies. I mean, things are going to get more and more expensive as time goes on. So I'm in favor of doing, as you said, Jeff, going back to the original plan of the high school. Maybe, I don't know what the costs are going to be now, because obviously costs are up. And maybe there's things that we tweak on that plan for future down the road, and we pay for that through cash or whatnot. But you know, I just don't, I don't think we change the course based on these numbers, because the elementaries are going to become middle school kids, and then they're going to go to high school. So, you know, let's not pick up, you know, step over dollars to pick up pennies.
The current high school, the way it was constructed, would be $224,600,000 at this time, with the added costs of an escalation rate. The consideration to think about would be, do you build a new middle school that is the plans for the current high school, and then expand upon that over time? So you build a middle school a little bit cheaper, it'd be $185 million right now. To build that same drawing that was done for the high school, much more scaled back, no field house, you know, trying to take into account for physical education, 3 gyms, otherwise you don't have the space you need, and then expand that out. For a high school at a later point, so you still keep what had come out of the fall focus group was they really want to remain a one high school district. We can surely do a survey, maybe they aren't interested in one high school district anymore, but otherwise you're going to go to a 2 high school district, which was not the will of our community. They really want to remain that one high school at Central Phil as part of the community. And if that's what you want, you could look down the road. The question becomes, you've got to structure in a way that you know you'll have bond dollars that you could get as you're moving down the pipeline, and as you outgrow this building. You might look at putting it into different CTE spaces, get the 6-8 together. Part of our challenge is not just programming at the high school, but it's also programming at the middle school. Currently, we have 6-7 center and 8th grade center. The challenge with the 8th grade center is we are doing part-time teachers, and therefore we are not able to run the elective courses that kids need to prepare them for high school. And so how do we get 6th through 8th grade together, which again was a will of the focus group of our parents. We really wanted to have that experience for our adolescent students to be educated together through a 6-8 building. So I think there's 2 different ways, and I surely can bring both languages on Monday, along with additional information you might need to make that decision for resolution, if that's your will. I mean, it's really me bringing you forward some resolutions that you could vote on Monday to have that resolution ready, as long as I have an indication of what you might be interested in looking at.
I personally like the idea of doing the middle school and getting 6th, 7th, and 8th together, and then having that option within whatever it's 10, 15 years that we need to add on to it to become a high school, and then changing Central High School into a middle school as needed. But that would allow us to get that elementary space available shortly for our students, and then get 6th, 7th, and 8th together, and then have that ability to not piecemeal it, but it's seeing into the future and not putting such a huge burden on the taxpayers today.
But I guess my question for you is, how does that really help us today? I mean, look at this auditorium, right? Like, when I attend a band concert, we have parents and students sitting on the steps. Like, we're already at capacity in this high school, so if we build a middle school, how is that going to help us in the high school when, like, going through passing periods? I've been in passing periods with the students where I can barely get through. So I guess is that still not a Band-Aid if we go the middle school route versus the high school? Because I feel like, especially by his numbers, we're already there, right? Look at the cafeteria. You got students sitting on the floor eating their lunch. Like, how is that going to really help us now? And I do agree with you, like, even if we went the high school route, I mean, to Mark's point, we can maybe refigure it a little bit differently. But I guess I'm just looking at the building as it is today. I just don't see us being able, this isn't sustainable. Especially if we continue to keep growing the way they're saying we are. I mean, Esther's inching for this here.
Well, I just want to give you all the facts, right? So I think the other thing to consider is, obviously, one of the things Rob talked about is programming. We mentioned in the last presentations of town halls is we cannot offer the career tech education programs that are necessary for our students to be able to go out into the workforce. Not all of our kids go out to college. And so how do we have the CTE labs that they need This is similar to if you think about your house and you adopted students and you put on bedrooms for them. You don't increase the rest of the size of your house, but you have to maintain the little that you have. So bathrooms are limited, cafeterias are limited, lab space is limited, you can see the auditorium is limited, and it's really about what do you want for the students. So it's a mix between what you believe you want for your students, the opportunity for the kids in terms of learning. We do some programs, we're very creative in terms of regional pathways and some of those types of things, but definitely we can't expand programs here. We do not have the CT space or any lab space in order to make any improvements or any increased programming without some kind of an addition or some kind of a shift. The 20 classroom addition are simple classrooms. They're 900 square foot classrooms that will house a classroom, a core classroom. We do not service as a lab or as any other facility to provide for some type of auto, welding, some of the things we hear parents asking for. We just don't have the facilities in order to build those.
One other thing about classroom size, 31 students in a classroom is very large. It is very hard to educate 31 students and be able to meet all their needs and give them what they need, and that's at a high school level. Then you go back to 26 in a kindergarten classroom, and I mean, there's nothing we can do right now about it. That is a lot of students. So when you're talking about meeting their needs and their learning, that's another challenge that there's nothing you can alleviate right now across the board, K through 12, because of the district space we have.
I don't know what a middle school would do other than create a Band-Aid, and I don't think that would last 10 to 15 years. We'd have a $185 million referendum if that did pass. In 5 years, we'd have to go back out for, by then, an $80 million addition.
It may not have the bond.
Who knows?
And we may not have the bond to do so. It's a nice idea, it's 10 million less. And I mean, I know this is funny money
Well,
because we're
it's
just
more than
talking.
10.
No, it's more than 10.
225 million.
Yeah.
No.
So we would change
So
the
it's
language to 225.
the cost of what we were gonna do is
It's
now
gone up.
225.
So there's no way to scale the high school back to stick with the 195.
You would get a middle school, you get no, that is no stadium.
What you
No,
said.
what I said is no stadium, no field house. So you're scaling
All right.
way back.
I don't think you're gonna have taxpayers.
So the delays already cost us, what, 30 million?
Yep.
It's just facts.
And if we went with the 9 middle schools, the 9th grade center, kept this building as 10 through 12, a principal would love to deal with parking issues because we would still have parking issues because this would be 10, 12, so very minor in the scheme of things, but just another thing that this building has outgrown its use. All right, so we go with the 2 languages.
Yep.
Two.
Well, let's get into the 2 languages and we'll see them and we can discuss it more. And but I definitely would personally like to see the high school language.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think it's also important to note.
I think it's also important to note that, you know, while we're trying to educate kids and everything else, it does pay a toll on the real estate values in our district if we keep putting Band-Aids on this. So, you know, from that standpoint, for the people that own real estate in this market, I mean, it's, you know, we're stepping over dollars to pick up pennies, so we need to throw that out there as well.
All right, any more discussion on that? Good to my left, I'm right.
Good to your left.
All right. I need a motion second to adjourn tonight.
So moved.
Second.
Paul?
Yes.
Hento?
Yes.
Pappas?
Yes.
Colby?
Yes.
Duffy?
Yes.
Mormon?
Yes, the motion is carried. Thanks for everybody for coming out.